yourself chasing these people away, because she has a tendency to criticize these people, and you don't do that.
Right.
You want someone to give you $5 for a cup of coffee, you don't call them a name. You need to cool it. You have to be careful.
Right.
And then she's been very critical, and she wants for me to go to Musk. I said, I've been to Musk. I've been to him on several occasions. I said, but understand, I was with him when he was at the pinnacle of the SpaceX program. He didn't have time to go to the bathroom.
I love it.
But they don't understand that. The guy's a 24/7 worker. I mean, he's an incredible guy. By the way, he's a very charismatic gentleman. He is. And he is approachable, contingent upon his time frame. On the other hand, if you force him in the corner, he'll ostracize you. He don't want anything like he's doing right now with the Twitter people that went after him.
Yeah.
He'll no longer have a job.
Did you see what he said? He was like, he's like, I love and appreciate these the brilliance of these geniuses, but they can be appreciated somewhere else. I love that. He's brilliant. I love it.
But this is not a tit for tat, and I respect that. I believe it should come from the Serbian government.
Absolutely.
Because they're the authority. They can make
I want to bring my camera too.
But I really appreciate that insight.
Yeah.
What needs to happen, a formal invitation from President Vujić in Serbia,
Okay.
signed by him and by members of his cabinet, that emphasizes the magnitude of importance of this event, to the extent Tesla has always been known as the father of light, father of bringing light, more importantly, to the economy of a successful United States of America.
What you just said is not verbatim of what I said, but the father of light is critical, because light is knowledge,
Yes.
and it's critical that we went from a dim gaslight to a brilliant,
Luminous.
Well,
luminous.
and it's all thanks to him, and he had to do it. Life is strange. I think that the abrasiveness and going after him caused him to work harder and faster and better, having had to deal with that myself. Is you have people that attack you for doing good, and so you fight back or you die, and you fight back, and he kept fighting back and he blessed us all because of what his not giving up, his willingness to.
I'm sorry, sir.
Check.
Check.
Check. I did one on the campus.
Oh, the man would like some.
Oh, that David, that is so.
We
well
had
done.
some fantastic meetings
I want to write
subsequent
down
to our
He would put-
initial organizational phases years ago. We didn't always agree, but when we did agree, it represented the substance necessary to move forward. I tried to bring some heavyweight speakers and what have you to our events in the past, just to gather access to some additional recognition and
Can I get the check?
There it is.
That's what you just did.
that getting back to
I'm done.
what Jason asked earlier, I can give you one specific experience I had in
Thank you.
when I
Did you
was
put
on
a
the
tip?
Apollo program.
20%.
I had become very close to a number of the astronauts. I managed a team of individuals, and the primary focus was on what they call the review of PDRs and CDRs. That's the preliminary design and critical design review to determine, if you will, that components, subsystems, and the systems were designed to withstand all of the rigorous arenas in which the spacecraft would be subjected to. So during that period, we met with the astronauts at least once every 2 weeks, and I become very close to two of those, or three of those actually. One guy, Pete Conrad. The other one was, I'll think of his name here in a minute. I knew John Glenn quite well, even though he wasn't on the Apollo program. I met him when he was in the Senate. But Gordon Cooper is a Horatio Alger story to the nth degree. Gordon Cooper grew up on an Indian reservation in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and he made it through, Apollo spacecraft training and whatever have you. And he and I became pretty good friends. And many years later, I met him in Paris. I was attending the Paris Air Show. At that time, I worked for the French company. They were the actual host of the week's event, and I was checking in the hotel, and I hear someone screaming my name, and I'm saying, "They found me, and I just got here," sort of thing. And it was Gordon who was sitting back in a booth having a cocktail. I said, "Gordo, you here for the show?" He said, "What show?" I said, "Paris Air Show." He said, "No, I completely forgotten about it. I'm here on, I'm just returning, from Germany, and I'm stopping in Paris and do a little shopping and what have you, and I'm on my way back." I said, "Would you be interested in attending the soiree?" He said, "Yeah, I would." I said, "I want you as my guest." He said, "What do you have to do with it?" I said, "Well, I'm the director of the U.S. company." He said, "I had no idea." He said, "I represent Avions Marcel Dassault in Washington, D.C. He said, "I'd love to go." I said, "It's a black tie event?" He said, "I have no tie." He said, "Don't worry about it. We'll get you a tux." He said, "How are you going to do that?" I said, "You're an astronaut, so you can have anything you want." And he cracked up laughing. So nevertheless, we were having a few toddies, and we were getting a little loose there for a while, and I said, "What have you been doing with yourself since you retired?" He said, "I've been funded by Disney and another company in Southern California." He says, "And I have orchestrated a collaborative agreement with a small laboratory where I had convinced these supporters and these donors to provide the funds, provide funds as necessary to complete the research, development, test evaluation, and the actual manufacture and production of technology that was orchestrated back in the early 1900s. I said, "Really?" He said, "This guy was a genius." He said, "David, you have no idea who this guy is." I said, "Try me, Gordon." He said, "The guy's name is Nikola Tesla." I said, "Gordon, look me in the eye now and think about what you just said. You've been over to our house for serving Christmas. Okay? And then I said, you work closely with our director, Mike Vujić, who was a Apollo Space Launch Team director at the time." He said, "Man, I forgot all about that." He said, that's incredible." I said, "Yeah." I said, and he said, "I'm working on the on the bladeless turbine right now. He said, I have several other things I'm looking at. And then, unfortunately, he had passed away several years later. But he knew Tesla like the back of his hand. And so did a lot of the other astronauts, like Bill Reedy, who's a space shuttle commander. And you'd be amazed how many of these guys could quote Tesla verbatim. I mean, it was incredible. So, for me, it was an outstanding experience to have been associated with these people, whereby, you know, they've developed the technology, systems, whatever have you, to overcome a lot of the unfortunate circumstances of lack of technology. Because looking back historically, back in the early 60s, we virtually had no technology to build a spacecraft. We had nothing. We started from ground level zero. What prompted this sudden burst of interest is 2 Sputnik launches. And all of a sudden, John Kennedy recognized that we need to do something about this. So President Kennedy had his group of NASA people review what could be made available to challenge the Sputnik project. And he said, we need to find the best possible contractor. And mind you, this was in late 59, early 1960. The contract was awarded to North American Aviation. And that was back in 1960, and everybody asked the question, why North American Aviation? I mean, what do they have that the Boeings and the Lockheeds and the, you know, McDonnell Douglases, what do they offer as opposed to the other who were competing? It's very simple. North American was a large corporation that had 3 divisions. One was called the Information Systems Division that later became the Space and Information Systems Division. The other one was their Electronics Division, the state-of-the-art electronics for radar systems and guidance systems, what have you. And the other one was the Rocketdyne Division that built the rockets that finally found their way in boosting the Apollo spacecraft, both Saturn II and Saturn V. That was one. The other very important element in the selection process was the fact that North American had large scientists and engineers within the organization in which the Space Division could draw from. Mm-hmm. So we were stealing engineers and scientists from all the other divisions, put them in the Space and Information Division. We were hiring and transferring 1,000 employees a week at that time. We had virtually nothing to begin with. We didn't have integrated circuits. They were developed by our Aeronautics Electronics Division. The mortality rate of a computer chip was 1 in 1,000 at that time, because it wasn't a proven technology at the time. Secondly, you know, we had no facilities. So all of a sudden, we found that the NASA folks were building their headquarters in Houston, and they're looking at Cape Canaveral for the launch site. At that time, we didn't have what is commonly referred to today as the vertical assembly building, which is a very tall structure where they would stack, if you will, the various rockets in the command module and move it down to the liftoff pad. That wasn't available. We developed all that stuff. Secondly, that huge, ugly beast that moved, if you will, the entire system, the rocket engines and the command module, 1 mile from the VAB, the vertical assembly building, all the way down to the launch pad. That big ugly thing that that was breaking speed limits at 1 mile an hour.
The slow crawler.
Yeah. And people say, well, who designed that system? I mean, that's an incredible piece of equipment. I said, nobody designed it. It was available. It was off the shelf. Off the shelf. How is that possible? I said, we had some people in our organization who were smart enough to understand the people in the mining business. So I went to the coal mining communities, and they found this huge, system. They said, that's all we have to do is modify it, to accommodate the spacecraft. No problem. So it was already available. And the company was called Bucyrus. But they were watching that thing just go down to the launch pad was incredible. So there were a lot of interesting stories prior to launch. We finally came up with attempting to convince the people at NASA we had a vehicle that flew at 3 times the speed of sound. As a matter of fact, North America had developed 2 trisonic aircraft back in 1958. One was called the XB-70 Valkyrie. It was a heavy bomber, flew above 85,000 feet at Mach 3.
Wow.
Unfortunately, the aircraft was never produced. We had 2 test vehicles. The other one was the X-15, which you're familiar with. That's, Chuck Yeager had flown that. But that was the other vehicle that we had introduced to NASA as a possible test bed to determine how the vehicle would respond in outer space. And NASA was very quick to remind us that we're not flying an airplane here. This is a different set of rules. The wings on that thing add nothing, if you will, to what we're attempting. So we need to look at a vehicle that is designed specifically, with penetration, into a specific orbit and return. And that's how they come up with this. The command module or the Apollo spacecraft. During that period, there were other questions. One in particular, during one of our CDR meetings, someone asked the question, since we have not spent an awful lot of time in a specific orbit, do we have any idea what our spacecraft might be confronted with? Because there's an awful lot of space debris out there. Space debris may penetrate, the command module, and we'll lose the command module as well as the astronauts. And so the question came up, what do we know about what we may be confronted with? No one had an answer. Finally, a young engineer stood up and said, sir, I think the folks that have an answer to that question are not at this table. They're called astronomers. He said, that's what they do for a living. He said, amazing. So, who knows an astronomer? I said, just call USC. They got a bunch of them over here studying the stars, So they brought in an astronomer. And the astronaut asked a question. What may we, anticipate during a launch of our space vehicle into extended orbit? We know there's an awful lot of space debris, plus a lot of mini meteorites or whatever have you in that area. And how can we overcome that? And the gentleman said, have any of you ever heard of the Proceed? I said, well, we really got dumb that minute. I said, no. He said, Proceed occurs April the 10th, or August the 10th and 11th, and sometime earlier for a couple of days. The Proceed is commonly referred to those who are novices to astronomy. is meteor showers. And that's what happens on that specific date. He said, I would suggest you not launch anything on that date. So that was, that was an interesting,
Yeah.
lesson that we learned. The other one was return of the capsule and re-entering, if you will, the Earth. And whether or not, the command module was designed to withstand tremendous amounts of heat and radiation from the sun. And we brought that up in a meeting, and one of the engineers said, I don't think we have to worry about that. I said, why not? He said, we've stuffed that thing with so much, systems and components, nobody's going to penetrate that thing. So those are the kinds of questions that came up. The questions that I received when I was briefing the program is, how is it that those two astronauts were on the moon and they put a flag in the ground and it was flaring? And I said, it wasn't. He said, what? There was all these pictures about the moon with the American flag on the surface of the moon, and it was flying in a breeze. I said, there's no breeze on the moon.
Amen.
I says, the astronauts and the NASA folks had anticipated these types of questions. So what they did is they took a flag and they put curtain rods in the inside, and so when they unfurled it, it would remain steady and look as though it was, flaring. And then the other question was, how is it possible these guys took pictures of themselves, when we don't see any cameras? We could see the reflection of the other astronaut, but he's not holding a camera, on and on and on. And I said, well, interestingly enough, they thought of that also. I said the camera was embedded in the spacesuit because they couldn't operate it with the gloves that they had on. So they activated it, when they were looking to take some photographs.
Great man. Great
But
information.
but those are the types of questions that normally came up, and amazingly enough, we were quite fortunate. Even though we lost Apollo 1, we lost a dear friend of mine, Gus Grissom, in that flight. But why did that happen? NASA has been very careful not to go into any further discussion on that unfortunate loss and the loss of those three astronauts. The designer of the escape hatch on the Apollo program was a scientist engineer from MIT, who actually came from the submerged systems technology. He was a submarine designer, developer, what have you. And he felt that the hatch that they had developed for the submarines would be applicable to spacecraft. Only one difference. Submarine escape hatch opens, you have to push it out. Okay? No, you have to push it, you have to pull it in, I'm sorry. Pull it in. When the unfortunate accident occurred, the guys could not get the hatch open because it was locked in there. Okay? And by the time they got to the astronaut, it was 90 seconds later, and they were burnt to a crisp. So North American Aviation, who had developed the space hatch, the space escape hatch technology, a Serbian fellow by the name of Danilo Vujić, we installed a system. We tested it a dozen times. We tested it to aerospace specs. where all exit systems are blown away from the spacecraft or the aircraft. So we had installed it, and then we ran a couple of tests, and then we had some of our test pilots get in and try to get out of it. Took 3 seconds, as opposed to 90. But those are the unfortunate circumstances that, and we learn, if you will, from
Mistakes.
those failures, and understand that we tested and tested and retested just about everything imaginable. Why? Because we had no idea as to what we were about to be confronted with. We had no idea once our guys were in orbit whether or not they would be confronted with some unknown. So we prepared the best we possibly can under the circumstances. But the fact remains is we were very careful, and our dear friend Mike Vujić, another Serb who was at that time, he was the director of systems engineering and director of the Apollo space launch team for North American aviation. Mike was an incredible engineer, and he stuck very close to his people to see to it that everything met, if you will, form, fit, and function. And amazingly enough, it wasn't long after that we had to deal with Apollo 13, where these 3 astronauts were unfortunately caught in a bind. They lost several of their systems that were destroyed, and there was very little remaining in the way of oxygen for them to survive. So lo and behold, Mike, who was a super genius, conveyed to NASA several of the areas that he felt may be applicable to overcoming this dilemma. And we only had a window of several minutes, and it worked. And it brought back, our 3 astronauts safely. And I'm proud to say that Mike received the Medal of Freedom from President Nixon as a result of that effort. But here are a bunch of guys, unknown heroes throughout our group. There were 7 of us, and one guy whose name was Milos Shabatovic came to this country. He was a mechanical engineer. He worked on the actual docking system. But Milos was actually a test pilot and a pilot in the Serbian Air Force. And we had another guy that he and I were in the Air Force together, and we happened to find ourselves on the same program. His name was Paul Vujić. He came from Centerville, Ohio. Paul headed up some of the logistics for the program, and then we had, as I mentioned earlier, this gentleman, David Vuich. He came from Montenegro. He was a PhD in I think mechanical engineering, and developed the escape system. We had Paul Gaich. Paul was Galovich. He was from the cowboy community of Hudson, Wyoming, and he was avionics systems engineer. Then we have Sam Vujić, who was also avionics test engineer. So there were 7 of us in that group at the time, and we pretty much stayed together and pursuing the objectives of the project. We worked anywhere from 10 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. We found behind schedule conditions we worked even harder because we wanted to meet, if you will, the demands of the project. There was, to a certain extent, a little bit of concern that we're moving too fast, but NASA was concerned that the fact remains is as you can well appreciate, NASA was in this pseudo space race with the Soviets at the time, so we couldn't afford any behind schedule conditions. So they made every attempt to overcome that, and the quality of individuals and their dedication to seeing this program succeed was incredible. One other gentleman, Nick, who you're probably not familiar with, his name is Mike Rebich. Mike was a quarterback at Georgia Tech many years ago, electronics engineer, and he was responsible for the development of the initial integrated circuit at the Autonetics division. So there were a few of us and more on that project throughout various regions, whatever have you. The importance of the success of the program had introduced technologies and methodologies to the commercial world of this country to the extent where everything has changed 180 degrees. You know, now we're using this product called Velcro we never heard before, you know. But we're using different types of materials that we didn't have access to, like Kevlar and titanium or what have you. But the important thing is we learned a lot from the Apollo program. North America then was the winner of the Space Shuttle program, primarily as a result of the success on the B-1 bomber program. And we had all the engineers and the facilities available to design, develop, and test that system. And I had the great pleasure of meeting several of the Space Shuttle astronauts. And I was looking forward to segue into the Space Shuttle program, but because of my Air Force background, they moved me into the aviation group, where I became involved in the RDT&E of the B-1 bomber program, which was also a outstanding program. And understand that a good percentage of what we learned from the XB-70, the Apollo Saturn, as well as the Space Shuttle, found its way into the design and development of the B-1 bomber. It's incredible. Not only technology, stuff like structural mode control vanes in the wing center section. We were using cryogenic systems to move fuel throughout the system, because the entire aircraft was a gas station. So when we extended the wings, we had to do something with the fuel in the wings. So we relocated the fuel back into a part of the empennage. Those types of things. We had technology on that aircraft again that was developed in the Apollo program. So it was an incredible experience. I worked on that program from its inception to its final test flight, and then it was unfortunately canceled by the Carter administration. However, it was reinstated by Ron Reagan for production in 1982. During that period, I think I briefed every officer, member of Congress or international government, whatever have you, on that airplane. I used to get up in the morning, first thing I do is brief myself. It was incredible. But the highlight of the number of briefings that I conducted on the B-1 was interesting. The gentleman I worked for at the time, his name was General Bob Guerrero. Bob was a retired 3-star Air Force, just a delightful gentleman, World War II bomber pilot. Called me in his office one day and he said, "David," he said, "we have a distinguished guest going to join us at 3 o'clock. And I'd like very much for you to use your expertise in briefing him on the design characteristics of this aircraft. Take as much time as you wish. He's a delightful gentleman. You'll enjoy meeting him." I said, I'm prepared, sir." He said, "I know you'll do a good job." I said, "Sir, who may I ask, who is this gentleman?" He said, "You'll find out when he walks in the door." So now I'm having a little problem with my flight suit, not knowing who's coming through that door. And all of a sudden, I'm waiting under the full-scale mock-up. We didn't have the aircraft at the time. Waiting under the full-scale mock-up. of the B-1 bomber, and in walks this guy. And I just about hit the deck. It was General James Doolittle.
Wow.
And so I spent about an hour with him, walking him through the aircraft, introducing him to the propulsion systems, to the avionics systems, to the aerodynamics and the weapon systems and what have you. Took him up in the cockpit and I said, sir, what do you think of the office up here? He said, David, I wouldn't know what the hell to do with all this stuff. But just a delightful gentleman. And then upon conclusion, he says to me, David, he said, you've done an outstanding job. He said, you really know this airplane like the back of your hand. I said, thank you, sir, I appreciate that. It's an honor for me to receive a compliment from such an accomplished gentleman. He said, you're kind, David. He said, I want you to attend our banquet across the street here, a club called the, it's a club that includes old aviators, go all the way back to the First World War. I'll think of it here in a second, but he was its first president. He said, I'd like very much for you to attend. I said, I'd be delighted and honored, sir. So I walk into the huge hall, and I find a seat in the back, and I figure I better take that because it was quite crowded. And General Doolittle walks in, and everybody's standing up and clapping for him, and spots me in the corner, and he walks over to me. And I figure he's going to meet with someone that I'm sitting with. What have you? He says, David, what are you doing back here? I said, this is the only seat that was remaining, sir. He said, no, you're sitting with me on the dais. I said, why am I doing that, sir? He says, I want everybody to know who you are, and I want them all to come to this facility to know about this airplane. I said, thank you, sir. So I go up to the stage and puts me next to the podium, next to him. The guy sitting on the other side of me is General Curtis LeMay. I couldn't believe it. I just went, I can't, and both of them were 33rd degrees, Nick, both of them. It was incredible. But that's the sort of experience that I enjoyed working in the aerospace and in the aviation industry. And rest assured, Serbs and Tesla and Putin had contributed so much to that industry that people are so terribly, oblivious to. I feel what you all have accomplished to date is not only to be recognized, but to be honored. I feel very close to my dear friend Nick, who, as I mentioned earlier, has been dedicated and persevered through under the most difficult set of circumstances to see this organization succeed and to gain the recognition it deserves. And I thank you, gentlemen, for offering your expertise and talents necessary to carry it forward. It's important that we continue this mission. In my opinion, we've only just begun to fight,
Right.
taking a word from John Paul Jones. But on the other hand, the fact remains is, as technology continues to gather momentum, look into the finite details of the types of technology that are being selected for, say, for example, the Artemis program and some of the other space programs. You can actually see a lot of Tesla in the design and development. And I think at some point in time, it might behoove us, especially those of you who are engineers and scientists within the organization, to look at some of the systems that are being developed for Artemis and for future space exploration, determine what percentage of that system can be accredited to Tesla, and catalog all that stuff. Make people aware that, the Artemis program includes this system was developed by Tesla in 1919, sort of thing, But it's important that every avenue that we may see materialize that would allow us an opportunity to further emphasize the importance of Tesla, I think we ought to jump right in the middle of it, because it's beginning to gather momentum, and it's all been positive. It's been positive because you gentlemen have followed the lead from Nick to make this happen. And God bless you. I want to thank you all, you know, from the bottom of my heart. I thank you for your committed dedication. As Nick may have told you, I have been dealing with an unfortunate illness here for the last several years. And I'm not certain as to whether or not I will be permitted to come to New York, even though I want to be there. The fact remains is, at this juncture, I can't journey too far away from my doctor and my hospital.
You're there with us in spirit, sir.
And so I have, and it's amazing. It's not the cancer cell that's causing me the problem. It's the bile duct that's causing the problem.
What?
The bile duct, because the cancer cell is blocking it. And in order for the natural bile to flow, they have to put in a stent. So far, I've had 10 stents, you know, but it's something that I've been dealing with. My wife Ginger and I become aware of the symptoms, and we've been able to manage it and control it accordingly. So we thank our dear Lord every day for, having survived a near unfortunate set of circumstances. But I'm overwhelmed. I mean, people are saying, how do you do it? I said, I have a partner that kicks my butt every day and makes sure I do the right thing. And the fact remains is, I'm pretty good about taking direction. And the guy that sits behind the stethoscope is something I don't understand. He used terminology I've never heard before in my life. So what he didn't know, I come back to my house and I look all that stuff up on a computer and I challenge him, those kinds of things. But he said, you asked the right questions. And I have some very good friends that are in colleges that have also offered me alternatives. I've been extremely fortunate and forever grateful. Well, I hope I've been able to at least provide you with certain insight as to the background and the importance of what we've all set out many years ago in a little restaurant in Philadelphia, and having a Slivovitz and talking about Tesla. It has developed into a humongous organization. And again, Nick and those of you who have supported him for all of these many years are to be congratulated to the nth degree for where you have taken a vision that he had and see it materialize in a successful organization that is today. So I can't thank Nick enough for inviting me to play a role very early in this program. He and I had a lot of frustrating experiences, but more importantly, we had more success. And I thank you all, and God bless you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dave.
Dr. David Vuich.
Yeah, that was great.
That was absolutely epic, sir.
I'm glad I got it.
Okay, I have one thing what they need.
Thank you, Jason.
Jason, you can take the camera. I'll stay here.